John Malcolm joins me now, who's Vice President for the Institute for Constitutional Government and Director of the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. John, are any of these Democrats actually interested in examining Judge Barrett and how she might rule or not how she would rule, but the way in which she would serve as an Associate Justice on the Supreme Court?
Oh, I think Judge Barrett's suffering is just beginning. The next 2 days are going to be very, very difficult for her. No, I don't think. Look, she's not going to offer any hints or suggestions about how she might rule in any case that would come before the Supreme Court. And I think you are going to hear through her questions a lot more of what you heard today. I mean, when I tuned in, I actually thought at first I had tuned into the wrong hearing, and that we were having a hearing about the merits and demerits of Obamacare. It turns out that is not what we were doing, but that is obviously their line of attack. Is that they somehow think that Judge Barrett is going to be responsible for anybody with a pre-existing condition or anybody who might lose their health insurance or what the fate of Obamacare might be. She has certainly been critical of the reasoning of Chief Justice Roberts in the first Obamacare decision. So was President Obama after that opinion came out. He liked the results, but he said the Chief Justice was wrong to call this a tax. It was a penalty. And the reason was because if they had called it a tax at the time that Obamacare was first being considered, nobody would have ever voted for it, because then they would be saying we're voting for a tax increase. But that's what you're going to hear. Is you're going to say, aren't you going to be in favor of gloom and doom and everything that we progressives can't stand? And are you going to deny it? And, of course, you'll say, I'm not going to offer any hints about how I might rule, and they'll say, see, for this reason, we're going to vote against you. They were already voting against
I got to tell you, John, some of the stuff I heard today, it ought to stun people that this massive overhaul of health insurance actually directly affects 20 million people, because they keep coming back to that number. Why 20 million people depend on Obamacare? And I think there are 330 million people in the country, so this affects maybe 6 or 6.5 or 7% of the entire population. It sounds like something that should have been handled by a specific program. They also have used at least one member today said 135 million people with pre-existing conditions. And yet we know that under Obamacare, the number of people covered for pre-existing conditions was about 400,000. It was small enough that I think one health policy expert I talked to said they could have covered the whole thing with a specific federal program to cover pre-existing conditions that would have cost about $12 billion, which in a federal government budget as big as we have would be a rounding error. But none of these people, what does it tell us when none of these senators from the Democrat side are interested at all in asking her about what she's written or about other judicial decisions she's made?
Well, and all the arguments that you just made are policy arguments, which are perfectly appropriate, and there's a time and a place for them, but not when you're in a confirmation hearing for a Supreme Court justice. She is not supposed to be determining, nor is any judge supposed to determine whether something is a good policy or a bad policy. They are supposed to interpret statutes based on the text of those statutes that were passed by Congress and signed into law by the president, or to determine whether the law is in conformity with the supreme law of the land, which is our United States Constitution. And for that, you want to find out what are their views about how they approach such questions. How do they interpret things like the Commerce Clause and the taxing power? And you can find out a lot about somebody's judicial philosophy by asking them about it, but not by engaging in fear-mongering.
No, and in fact, the soundbite I played as we headed into this conversation, I thought was right on point. She said, look, you have a vital responsibility, but policy decisions should be made by the people's representatives. I keep emphasizing to my audience, those judges, they're insulated for a reason, appointed for life to the federal bench, including the Supreme Court, but all the other federal courts as well. But you don't want people who are unanswerable to the public making policy decisions about what laws to write, do you?
That's exactly correct. And so when she said it is not the job of a judge to right every wrong, it is the job of a judge to apply the law. And sometimes the law will come up with unjust results, in which case you need to amend the laws or throw the bums out who enacted the law in the first place. But it is not a judge's role to sit there and say, well, the law requires one result, but I consider it unjust, and therefore I'm going to put my policy preferences over those of the people's elected representatives.
Well, and do the Democrats have good reason to fear that while they can't ask Judge Barrett how she'd rule on Obamacare when it does, and it is coming up, or it's going to be heard in this next session, that they do have good reason to fear that the law will be found unconstitutional, don't they?
Well, look, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has found that the individual mandate is unconstitutional, and so that is the argument that's going to be made, and then whether or not that provision can be severed from the rest of Obamacare. I don't know whether they have a good reason to fear it or not. A federal district court judge went along with that argument. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has agreed with that argument, and that is the issue that the Supreme Court will take up. And I'm quite sure that the president did not ask her how she would rule in this particular case, and senators will try to get her to commit one way or the other as to how she will rule in this particular case. But that is the exact wrong thing for a judge to do. No judge should ever prejudge an argument without considering the particular case and controversy involved and hearing from the arguments from lawyers and consulting with their colleagues on the bench.
So tell me this, John. In the next couple of days, Judge Barrett seems to have a really sweet demeanor. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine. I mean, 7 kids at home. She's a judge. She's got all kinds of pressure on her, but she seems to carry herself very well. Do you think we're going to hear her push back in some pointed ways if these Democrats on the Senate committee start to really ask her pointed questions that try to push her into a corner?
No, she seems to be very, very even-tempered. I was curious what facial expression she was making under her mask today. It had to be a little bit tough sitting there that entire time. But look, when she was challenged in 2017 with Senator Feinstein saying that the dogma lived loudly in her, and that was a great concern, Senator Durbin asking whether she was an Orthodox Catholic, she was the quintessential example of grace under fire. And although she will be sorely tested, I expect that she will still remain grace under fire over the next 2 days.
Does it seem more likely today than it did perhaps a month ago that she will win, that the vote will be to confirm her, and that all this, hand wringing and twisting of pearls by the Democrats is all just theater, that it's going to end with a Senate confirmation vote? Well, I'm just wondering, because to me as a layperson, it seems like, okay, you're going to make a lot of noise, and then you know how the vote is going to go, just as they knew how the vote was going to go on impeachment.
Yeah, I was just laughing at the twisting with pearls metaphor. I rather like that. Yeah, look, I don't think that so Susan Collins has said she's going to be a no vote. She said that before there was a nominee. Lisa Murkowski hasn't particularly committed because she might be a no vote too. So that would take you down to 51 senators. The Democrats are going to have to persuade 2 other Republican senators to vote against Amy Coney Barrett. And I just don't see it because she was so superbly qualified.
Absolutely right. John Malcolm, Vice President at the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Institute for Constitutional Government.